Hi guys, so my name is Yasmin and I am a tutor here at Tutor Impact. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the heart and the cardiac cycle. So I'm just going to share my screen I will use this in today's lesson. So yeah, as I said, we're going to be looking at the heart and the cardiac cycle. Now, this is a frequent topic on quite a lot of GCSE and A-level syllabuses. So it's quite a good thing that you're watching this video, as hopefully it will be very helpful. So we're going to go straight in by looking at the heart. So as you can see on the screen here, we are looking at a human heart, and we're going to be discussing now the anatomy of that diagram. So as you can see from this diagram here, the heart is made up of 4 chambers, and this is divided into 2 sides. So we've got the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the heart. So in contrast to what you would probably normally assume from looking at this diagram, the left side of the heart is always drawn on the right-hand side. So don't get it confused with the labels. The left-hand side of the heart is always drawn on the right-hand side. So you can see on this diagram here that the left-hand side of the heart is on the right side of the diagram. And the reason for this is because when it's in the body, it's on the left-hand side of the person whose heart it is. So normally when you're looking at it in the body, it's that person's left-hand side of the heart. Whereas when you're looking at it from a diagram perspective, it's the other side. So just remember that it's the opposite way around to what you would first think. And the left-hand side of the heart is actually on the right-hand side. So looking at the diagram, we can see that the left-hand side of the heart has a much thicker wall. So this wall, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but this side of the wall on the left has a much thicker wall. And the reason of this is that it needs to pump more strongly to deliver blood all around the body. Whereas, as we'll go on to discuss later, the right-hand side of the heart only needs to send blood to the lungs. So it doesn't need that extra muscle wall to pump it around the body. So as we said, the left-hand side has this much thicker wall to pump the blood all around the body. And this left-hand side carries oxygenated blood, whereas the right-hand side carries oxygenated blood, sorry. So left-hand side has oxygenated blood, which means it contains oxygen, whereas the right-hand side doesn't. And then looking at the chambers themselves, the top chambers are both called atria. So we have the right, well, atria is the plural, we have the right atrium and the left atrium. And combined, they're called the atria. But they are called atrium when you discuss them individually. So these chambers, they receive blood from the veins in your body, which are vessels, and they supply the heart. So the blood flows from these atria at the top down into the ventricles, which are separated from the atria by valves called atrioventricular valves. I've labeled these below. So we have the atrioventricular valves, which separate the atria from the ventricles. So it's quite easy to remember because it's just those names of the chambers. So they separate the blood between the atrium at the top and the ventricles at the bottom. And this prevents blood from flowing in the opposite direction. So as you can see, the valves look like this. So blood goes through and it struggles to get back. So it keeps the blood separate and stops it flowing back in the wrong direction. There are also another set of valves you can see on this diagram. These are the small ones here, and they are called semilunar valves. So those are the semilunar valves. They are obviously much smaller and they look like little half moons. And these are between the ventricles and the arteries. So the arteries are these vessels going away from the heart. And what those semilunar valves do is just separate the blood between the ventricles and the arteries. Now, moving on, we have the main artery, which is on the diagram. And this main artery takes oxygenated blood from the left side of the heart to the rest of the body, where the aorta, then takes it. So looking at this diagram, we can see that blood will start in the left atrium, it goes down into the left ventricle, and then it goes up through the main artery into the aorta, where it is then carried to the rest of the body. So that takes oxygenated blood away from the heart and into the rest of the body. Whereas the artery which delivers deoxygenated blood between the right side of the heart and the lungs is called the pulmonary artery. So the pulmonary artery, which is this purple one here, this carries deoxygenated blood away from the heart to the lungs, and that is called the pulmonary artery. So it takes the deoxygenated blood, so the deoxygenated blood comes into the heart, it goes into the right atrium, it goes down into the right ventricle, and then it goes up through the pulmonary artery and goes to the lungs. So when we also have veins which take blood to the heart. So the major vein which returns blood from the body to the right side of the heart is called the vena cava. And that carries deoxygenated blood from the muscles into the right atrium. So it's not labeled in this diagram, but it's this little hole here in the right atrium, and that brings the deoxygenated blood back to the heart. And then that is then carried, as I said, goes into the right atrium, into the right ventricle, and goes up through the pulmonary vein to the lungs. Once it gets to the lungs, that blood is then oxygenated and is carried back to the heart via the pulmonary vein, which you can see here. And then, as we discussed before, that oxygenated blood enters the left atrium, goes through the atrioventricular valves into the left ventricle, and is then pumped to the body through the main artery and through the aorta. So if you remember that the pulmonary, when we talk about pulmonary, we're referring to the lungs. And as I said, arteries are when the blood is carried away from the body. Veins is when they come back to the body. And that is how the blood is transported around the heart. So we'll quickly recap that again. So blood it starts coming deoxygenated from your muscles and comes into the heart via the vena cava. It goes into the right atrium. So the deoxygenated blood comes into the right atrium, goes down into the right ventricle. It's pumped out of the heart through the pulmonary artery, goes to the lungs where it is given oxygen. That oxygenated blood comes back from the lungs, via the pulmonary vein, comes into the left atrium, goes down into the left ventricle, and then the thick muscular wall of the left ventricle pumps that blood through the aorta around the body. And that is the full cardiac sort of system. We're now going to look at some of the veins we talked about in a bit more detail. So we've mentioned so far arteries and veins, and we're also going to discuss capillaries as well. So as we discussed before, arteries take blood away from the heart to various organs in the body. The way I remember arteries taking blood away is the letter A. We've got A for arteries and A for away from the body. So as you can see in the diagram here, these arteries have quite a thick muscular wall. So they obviously, as arteries are taking blood away from the body, they need to be able to cope with high pressure, which is generated from the heart forcing out blood with each heartbeat. So this is why they have this really thick muscular wall that you can see in the diagram. And this contains lots of elastic tissue, which means it can stretch to carry all of the blood. The inner lining of the arteries, which is called the endothelium, is also folded, which allows the artery to expand, which also helps it to withstand this high pressure. And then the small lumen, which is the part in the center, also helps to maintain that high pressure so that the blood is carried around the body. The next one, which we talked about before, are veins, which carry blood to the heart. So they carry blood from organs of the body towards the heart. Here you can see that they look quite a lot different from the arteries, and this is because they are serving to do a different purpose. As the blood flowing through veins is at much lower pressure, the veins have a large lumen and much thinner walls, which do contain elastic fibers, but just not as much as the artery. The veins also contain valves, which stops the slow-moving blood from flowing backwards in the wrong direction. And the contraction of muscles helps push the blood along through the veins. So as you can see, the arteries and veins have very different characteristics because they carry out different jobs. The final vessel, which we'll look at, are the capillaries. So the capillaries are what connect arteries and veins. So it goes between the two. And it's the capillaries, which is where substances move out of the blood to the body tissues. Things like oxygen, glucose, mineral ions, basically everything from the blood that those muscles need or that the body tissues need moves through these capillaries. And any waste products from those areas, such as carbon dioxide and water, will move out of those body tissues and into the capillaries. So we've got the things that those areas need, like oxygen, glucose, and mineral ions going out of the blood, and we have the waste products such as carbon dioxide and things such as water moving back into the capillaries. So the capillaries have small holes, which helps this process, called pores in their walls, and this enables this exchange of substances. Their walls are also just one cell thick, which reduces the diffusion distance for these substances, sorry. So the walls are very thin, which, as I said, helps transport these substances into and out of the capillaries. So those are the main vessels in the body. We're now going to look at how the cardiac cycle and how pressure is used to pump blood around the body. We spoke before about how the blood is transported in a physical sense, but we're now going to look at the sort of mechanics behind that process. So the cardiac cycle is made up of three key areas, sections, sorry. We have atrial systole, which is the first stage. We then have ventricular systole, and finally we have diastole. So when you feel your heartbeat, this is basically what you are feeling, this process. And we're going to discuss each step now. So the first one, as I said, in this process is atrial systole. So this is the first stage of the cardiac cycle. So to begin with, this is where the atria contract. So both chambers, as you remember, at the top of the heart, these both contract, they squeeze inwards, while the ventricles at the bottom relax. What this does is reduce the volume in these top atria because they're getting smaller, and that increases the pressure because the area is getting smaller as the atria contract. In turn, what this does, the pressure, so that pressure caused by the atria squeezing, it forces the atrioventricular valves to open, which we discussed before, so these valves here, and due to the pressure, this pushes the blood from the atria into the ventricles. So that is the first step in that cycle. So the blood from the atria is squeezed and by the pressure is forced through those valves into the ventricles, which are both at the bottom of the heart. What happens next is, so that blood has gone from the atria into the ventricles, we then have ventricular systole. So the ventricles, like the atria, it's their turn then to contract. So the ventricles contract while the atria are relaxed. And again, this decreases the volume inside, decreases the volume inside the ventricles. So again, the ventricles get smaller as they're squeezed, which, like the atria in atrial systole, this increases the pressure. Now, if it wasn't for the valves, which stop blood going back into the atria, at this stage, the blood would probably go back into the atria. But because the atrioventricular valves are closed due to the pressure change, this forces the semilunar valves to open. So the pressure in the ventricles is higher compared to the atria. So the atrioventricular valves close and the semilunar valves open. So the little half moon ones, which connect to the arteries, these then open. And what this means is that the blood is then forced out of the ventricles and into the arteries. So just to recap what we've talked about so far, we have atrial systole, which is where the atria contract, the blood is forced down by the pressure into the ventricles. We then have ventricular systole, which is where the ventricles then contract and the atrioventricular valves close, stopping backflow, and the blood is forced through the semilunar valves into the arteries. And then it is carried to wherever it is needed in the body. So it will either be the lungs or to the tissue with the oxygenated blood. So the last stage of this process is diastole. And what this means is that both the atria and the ventricles relax and the pressure in both chambers goes down. Since the pressure is then higher in the arteries than in the heart chambers, the semilunar valves are then forced closed, which prevents blood flowing backwards into the ventricles. And then blood is returned to the heart and the atria fill with blood. And then the whole process repeats itself. Now, I know this has been quite a lot of information, so I would advise listening to this again and trying to get to grips with the process. As you can see from this diagram, this is showing the pressure changes throughout the cardiac cycle. Now, I really recommend that you pause the video and try and match up the stages I've spoken about with the labels in the diagram. Now, this is everything for this lesson. We've spoken about the anatomy of the heart and the cardiac cycle. It's a really interesting topic, especially if you're interested in biology, and I hope it has been helpful. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully you watch another one of my videos soon. Bye for now. Thank you.